I'll call the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure to order. Pursuant to Rule 6F, House Rule 11, Clause 2HF, the chairman may postpone further proceedings today on any question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote of the yeas and nays were ordered. I'd ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's hearing, and without objection, that is so ordered. All bill and amendment texts have been distributed electronically, and paper copies are available here in the hearing room. I'd also ask unanimous consent for the committee to use an amendments roster for any items under consideration by the committee, and without objection, that is so ordered. And finally, as a reminder, the committee will use an electronic system for any requested recorded votes, and my intention is to hold the first vote open for 5 minutes, and then subsequent votes will be held open for 2 minutes, or upon discussion with the ranking member. We may adjust that down to a minute or so, and if that works, then we will do so. Today, the committee is considering an amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7659, the Coast Guard Authorization Act of 2024. Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6140, the Facilitating Access to Swiftly Transport Goods During a Publicly Announced State of Emergency Situation Act, or the Fastpass Act. And also, we've got 2 General Services Administration Capital Improvement and Leasing Program resolutions. Our first item for consideration is H.R. 7659, the Coast Guard Authorization Act of 2024. I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation from further consideration of H.R. 7659. Without objection, that is so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I recognize myself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. Clerk, please designate the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7659, offered by Mr. Graves of Missouri.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read and shall be considered as the base text for purposes of any further amendment. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. So the bill before us provides the men and women of the Coast Guard with the authorities and resources that they need to carry out their missions, which are critical to ensuring maritime safety. Enforcing the United States, and obviously enforcing the United States law at sea, and also protecting our nation's borders. The Coast Guard Authorization Act of 2024 authorizes Coast Guard funding for fiscal years 2025 and 2026. The bill will support Coast Guard operations and enable the service to continue its efforts to recapitalize its historically underfunded cutter fleet, shoreside facilities, and information technology capabilities. I want to thank Ranking Member Larson, Subcommittee Chair Webster, and Subcommittee Chair Carbajal for working to reach a bipartisan agreement on this bill. So H.R. 7659, it authorizes additional air and sea assets, including 1 polar security cutter, 2 missionized HC-130J aircraft, and some other vessels and aircraft. The legislation also prioritizes much-needed shoreside infrastructure improvements, including a hangar at Barbers Point Air Station. These proven assets and infrastructure improvements are going to support the service's efforts to meet their many missions. As the Coast Guard faces a deficit of 4,800 service members and civilian staff this year, the bill provides additional resources to enable the Coast Guard to address recruiting and manpower challenges. The legislation also amends requirements for merchant mariner credentials and authorizes the investments in the Coast Guard's antiquated merchant mariner credentialing system to facilitate an increase in the pool of qualified United States merchant mariners. Finally, the bill holds the Coast Guard accountable for its past failures to protect the members of the service from sexual assault and sexual harassment by promoting greater transparency and strengthening protections for service members. I want to thank Subcommittee Chair Webster and Subcommittee Ranking Member Carbajal for their leadership on that particular section and their introduction of H.R. 7557, which was the Coast Guard Protection and Accountability Act of 2024, which is included in this bill. I'd urge my colleagues to support the legislation, and with that, I yield back. I now recognize Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Chair, I support the amendment in the nature of a substitute for H.R. 7659, the Coast Guard Authorization Act of 2024. The bipartisan legislation to reauthorize funding for the U.S. Coast Guard for fiscal years 25 and 26, and to update Coast Guard programs and policies. This bill builds upon the already strong Coast Guard Authorization Act reported last year and is a result of bipartisan negotiations with the chair of the full committee and subcommittee and the ranking member of the subcommittee. Each of their thoughtful contributions have improved the bill and are appreciated. We've incorporated several committee member priorities from both sides of the aisle, and I want to thank those members as well for their contributions. The Coast Guard continues to suffer from insufficient funding. This has resulted in a $3 billion shoreside infrastructure backlog, insufficient icebreaking capacity in the Arctic and Great Lakes, as well as reduced capability across several essential missions such as marine safety and oil spill response. A few months ago, the Coast Guard alerted Congress it has a workforce shortage of 10%, which has reduced or eliminated Coast Guard services at more than 40 stations across the country. H.R. 7659 starts to address these problems. The legislation provides $14.8 billion for the Coast Guard for fiscal year 25 and $15.5 billion for fiscal year 26. These increases will ensure the service has the resources needed to take care of its service members and enhance their ability to operate new assets that are expected to come online in the coming years. I'm pleased as well that this legislation includes the Coast Guard Protection and Accountability Act. This legislation will strengthen protections for members of the Coast Guard from sexual assault and harassment while strengthening congressional oversight and transparency within the service. The Coast Guard must do better to protect coasties from assault and harassment. Last Congress, this committee passed substantial measures to increase vessel safety, and H.R. 7659 builds upon that work by addressing safety risks on vessels and increasing the penalties for negligent operations. The bill also includes provisions to improve oil spill prevention by bolstering vessel response plans and accountability. Lastly, H.R. 7659 includes vital provisions to begin to address the mariner shortage. The current mariner credentialing program, which the Coast Guard oversees, is an outdated system that depends on paper applications. Processing delays impact both existing and new mariners looking to enter the industry. I appreciate Chairman Graves working with me to include an authorization of $17 million for a new electronic credentialing system. This, coupled with other provisions, will begin to address the mariner shortage. In closing, I again want to thank the Chair Graves, as well as the Coast Guard Subcommittee Chair Webster and Ranking Member Carbajal for their cooperation in drafting this important legislation. Look forward to our continued collaboration as this legislation moves forward. And with that, I yield back.
I now recognize the Chair of the Subcommittee, Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Chairman Graves. Proud to support both the amendment in the nature of a substitute and the bill of 7659. The introduction, along with myself and Ranking Member myself and Ranking Member Larson and Carbajal. This bill builds on the Coast Guard's Authorization Act of 2023, which was approved by this committee last year and includes important priorities suggested by our colleagues. This bill supports the efforts of the Coast Guard to protect the United States waters, interdict drugs, stop human trafficking, and promote maritime safety. The Coast Guard Act of 2024 authorizes funding for the Coast Guard through fiscal year 2026 and makes crucial investments enable the service to meet the growing mission demands. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your work and legislation, along with Ranking Member Larson and Subcommittee Ranking Member Carbajal. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I now recognize the Ranking Member of the Subcommittee, Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm pleased to speak in support of H.R. 7659, the Coast Guard Authorization Act of 2024. This strong bipartisan legislation will reauthorize funding for the United States Coast Guard for fiscal years 2025 and 26 and reflects this committee's ongoing support for the people serving in the Coast Guard. I'd like to express my appreciation to Chairman Graves, Chairman Webster, and Ranking Member Larson. The Subcommittee on the Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation continues to be bipartisan, and this legislation is a shining example of what we can do when we work together in a bipartisan fashion. There's a lot of good policy in HR 7659, but I'd like to focus on what it does for coasties. This bill provides unprecedented funding to address the growing shoreside infrastructure backlog. This means better housing, childcare, and working conditions for coasties. The bill provides robust funding for the Coast Guard Academy and Training Center, Cape May. Every coastie enters the service in one of these two facilities and should not be subjected to decrepit conditions such as mold and asbestos. The bill provides support for recruiting and retention. When the service has a workforce shortage, everyone suffers. Coasties don't take leave or vacation, and missions become strained. And finally, I am proud that this bill includes the Coast Guard Protection and Accountability Act of 2024. This bill strengthens protections for every member of the Coast Guard by providing training, increasing oversight, ensuring accountability, and changing the culture within the service, and especially addressing sexual assault and harassment. In closing, I would like to again thank Chairman Graves, Chairman Webster, and Ranking Member Larson for this bipartisan collaboration. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to speak? Recognize 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to speak in support of this bill, specifically Section 401, which includes my bill, H.R. 7702. Our bill directs the GAO to study vessel fires within 3 miles of the shoreline. And let me tell you why this is so important to me and the constituents that I have the honor of representing. In July of last year, a fire broke out aboard a vessel docked at Port Newark in New Jersey and tragically killed 2 Newark firefighters. Their names were Augusto Agiacabow and Wayne Bear Brooks, Jr. These heroes were beloved by their families, friends, and the Newark Fire Department, and will be remembered for their bravery on that day when they did what firefighters across this country do and put it all on the line. And these 2 incredible individuals paid the ultimate sacrifice. Responding to vessel fires is incredibly difficult as each vessel is unique and the presence of smoke makes them difficult to navigate. My bill tasks the GAO to study vessel fires and federal and non-federal collaboration aimed at reducing vessel fire risk and to make recommendations on preparedness, responses, and training for fires of this nature. Augusto Agiacabow and Wayne Bear Brooks Jr. are heroes, and I'm pleased that this bill was included in the Coast Guard reauthorization in their honor. I support this bill, and I encourage my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Menendez. Does anyone else wish to be heard on the bill? Seeing no one, we'll now move on to consideration of amendments, and I now recognize myself for the manager's amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute, which I have at the desk. Please designate.
A manager's amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7659, offered by Mr. Graves of Missouri, number 001.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes to speak on the manager's amendment. Obviously, I support the manager's amendment and appreciate the work of all my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to come to an agreement, and I'm glad we were able to incorporate several members' amendments into the manager's package. Among its provisions, the amendment provides additional authorized funding for retirement pay. It strengthens maritime credentialing review. It requires reporting on Coast Guard efforts in St. Paul, Alaska, and provides training and certification programs to create more jobs for United States maritime workers. The amendment also includes language that allows the maritime industry to adapt to changing technology and clarifies the intent of the previous Coast Guard Authorization Acts. With that, I would obviously urge support, and I'd yield back and recognize Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to express my support for the bipartisan manager's amendment, which includes several amendments from members on both sides of the aisle to strengthen the underlying bill. Included in the amendment are provisions that strengthen enforcement of abandoned and derelict vessels, increasing employment opportunities for American mariners, and strengthening Coast Guard search and rescue preparedness. I appreciate the members of the committee have offered these thoughtful contributions to the bill, and Chair Graves for working with me to produce a strong bipartisan bill. With that, I urge my colleagues to support the amendment and yield back.
Do any other members wish to be heard on the manager's amendment? Mr. Graves.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I appreciate everyone's hard work on the Coast Guard legislation, on the authorization bill. I think it's a really important bill, and I think the Coast Guard is an underappreciated service, as we've talked at length in this committee over the years, with the incredible diverse mission that they exercise over the waters of the U.S. and around the world. There's a really important provision that's in the base text of this bill that we have offered as an amendment for the two past Coast Guard bills, and it has to do with crewing and manning. We in this committee have discussed at length some of the issues related to mariners coming in here from Russia, from other countries that certainly don't share America's security interest. And I appreciate this year the provision being in the base text of the bill. It passed out of this committee by overwhelming margins twice. I believe once we had only 2 nay votes, and the second time, I think maybe 3 or 4 no votes on the amendment. So it certainly is appropriate with that type of bipartisan support that it be in base text. I also want to register a couple of concerns. There was a change to the base text that I think we do have some concerns with. As I have said, every single time we have discussed this amendment, we are absolutely willing to have discussions with stakeholders. I've met with every stakeholder that has asked to meet. We have offered to negotiate and address any legitimate concerns that have been raised, and we have had no takers. I'm going to say that again. We have offered to negotiate. We have offered to have discussions about concerns with the legislation that have been raised, and we have had no takers. Yet, one, the base text of the bill does have some changes. And secondly, one of the amendments from my friend from Florida that is being included in the manager's amendment is not supported by myself or the Louisiana delegation. I think I can speak on their behalf. Mr. Chairman, as you know, off the coast of Louisiana, you effectively have 6 states that do offshore conventional energy, and that's Alaska, California, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. You can take all of the offshore energy in those federal waters and of the other states, of Alaska, California, of Texas, Mississippi, and Alabama, you'd have to multiply it times 4, all of their energy production in federal waters to match the amount of energy production we have off the coast of Louisiana. So we have more energy stakeholders, energy interests than all of these other states combined. And those are the only states that produce offshore energy in federal waters, conventional energy in federal waters. So we certainly have all interest at heart. I have strong concerns about my friend from Florida's amendment being included in here. Mr. Chairman, I just ask it, you and Ranking Member Larson, that you all would work with us as we move toward the floor to make sure that we have struck the right balance here, thinking about America's defense industrial base, U.S. security, and proper labor regulations or proper labor conditions for those operating in our offshore areas. And let me say it again, I certainly am not here to oppose the managers or oppose the bill in any way, but I would just like to ask if you and Mr. Larson be willing to work with us, Leader Scalise and others, as Mr. Carter, a member of this committee, and others as we move toward the floor.
So absolutely.
Mr. Larson, are you okay if we just have a chance to talk a little bit more about this?
Pretty all right, yeah.
Y'all are the best. Thank you very much, and I'll say it again, I'm certainly not going to object to this, to the manager's amendment or underlying bill, but just appreciate y'all's willingness to work with us as we move forward.
Do any other members wish to be heard on the manager's amendment? Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for you and Mr. Larson and the chairman and ranking member of the subcommittee, thank you for putting together a comprehensive Coast Guard reauthorization bill. I want to follow up on Mr. Graves' remarks about the crewing of vessels in the offshore energy business. Presently, there are extraordinary loopholes and I believe improper opportunities for foreign crews to operate in the offshore energy industry. The underlying original law basically said that the crews of foreign vessels operating in the offshore energy industry should be from the country, must be from the country that owns the vessel. In the many, many years of operation of that part of the law, the Coast Guard has managed to ignore the fundamental law, and therefore many, if not most, of the offshore vessels operating in the energy industry are crewed by the cheapest maritime worker available from the entire world. And these individuals are given a visa, and they can go literally anywhere in the United States to find employment on any ship, foreign and even domestic. It is a loophole that is dangerous. It is a situation that creates a national security risk in that these individuals are not required, as American mariners are, to obtain a TWIC card. In other words, be certified as not being a security risk. So they hold the visa, they can operate on any ship, and they can go into any port without the same background check that an American worker has. So in the legislation, or in the bill as presented to us, is a correction to this problem. And I want to thank the Big Four for including the amendment that Mr. Graves and I have offered. I won't follow up on everything Mr. Graves has put, but the amendment has been before the committee twice and passed in an overwhelming margin, 2 no votes and 4 no votes in the 2 times it's come before the committee. And so what we find is that, for example, on the offshore energy industry, you will find Russians, Ukrainians, and people from every other country in the world holding a visa giving them full access, not only to the ships and the vessels, but also to the ports, without any background check at all. So the bill as presented to us solves that problem. And I want to thank the leadership of the committee and the subcommittee for including a solution and resolution of the problem in the bill. Thank you. I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing no one, are there any amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The amendment is agreed to. All right. Are there any other further amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? And I believe Mr. Garamendi has one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Please designate.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7659, offered by Mr. Garamendi of California, number 176.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Garamendi, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a very simple amendment. It provides clarification of what is an agricultural product. Presently, the requirement is that food programs from the United States should be, a significant percentage of them should be shipped on American vessels. Presently, those agricultural products are considered to be commodities. This amendment would simply say all kinds of agricultural products, food manufactured as well as commodities. It simply provides a clarification of what an agricultural product is. And it's that simple, and it will create a small but important increase in the cargo that American ships would be able to deliver to locations around the world that are suffering from famine and food shortages. That's the amendment. I'd ask for an aye vote.
Say again.
Pardon?
I didn't hear it. I didn't hear what you said.
I'm sorry, I can't.
They didn't hear the last part.
Well, that brilliant statement apparently wasn't loud enough for everybody to hear. I can go back through it all again, but I would ask for an aye vote.
Yes, for what? Oh, yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes to speak on the amendment. I do support the concept of the amendment. I do believe that the issue is better addressed elsewhere and not in the Coast Guard reauthorization. I do want to point out as well, we did include it in the transportation section that we put into the NDAA as well. So,
If I might, Mr. Chairman. I had hoped that we would have a positive answer to my request. I do think this is appropriate in this bill, but given the position of the chair, I withdraw the amendment.
thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Moving on, Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got an amendment at the desk number
Please
434.
designate.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7659, offered by Mr. Perry of Pennsylvania, number 434.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Perry, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment simply creates an exemption to the Jones Act requirements for ships carrying liquefied natural gas, a sector of the market, the maritime industry, I'm not really sure why, but they refuse to serve despite its complete insulation from foreign competitors, harming Americans and empowering our enemies. This amendment still applies these restrictions to Russian, Chinese, and Iranian-flagged and crewed ships. Well, there have been some improvements in the industry, and I'll acknowledge that. The few Jones Act LNG ships that have been produced are refueling ships, not transport ships. Anyone who conflates the two is purposefully misleading the American people to protect the shipbuilding industry, union leadership, and foreign adversaries at their own constituents' expense. The failure to produce LNG transport ships, despite over a decade of record-high natural gas production in the U.S., lays bare the failures of protectionism in incentivizing ship production. Instead, the lack of competition has resulted in a roughly $500 million differential between a Jones Act-compliant ocean-going LNG carrier and a foreign ship. The truth is, the failure of the shipbuilding industry to meet this moment and produce affordable ships is the reason American cities, territories, and states are unable to consume American LNG and instead are forced to accept foreign natural gas from Russia, as Puerto Rico did in February of 22, right as Putin invaded Ukraine. This completely undermines our economic security and our national security, destroying the very basis for the Jones Act itself, as it benefits our enemies at the expense of American natural gas producers and consumers. You can support the shipbuilding industry in America and the natural gas industry at the same time. We just fail to do that. Unfortunately, there have been some misleading claims to undermine this amendment. I'd like to take some time to address those now. For those who claim that New England should be on its own due to its decision to reject pipeline infrastructure, this argument fails to reconcile the situation in Puerto Rico, which imports more natural gas where pipeline infrastructure is not a possibility. Moreover, opponents admit that New England is indeed importing foreign natural gas, imported on foreign vessels that could be replaced by American liquefied natural gas. Claims that this will open up domestic commerce to foreign ships, that is obviously true, but it fails to recognize that the current status quo is foreign LNG being imported from foreign sources. These ships are already currently entering our ports. The only difference with this amendment is that they would be providing American natural gas. Finally, claims that this exemption would allow the use of American natural gas would somehow undercut the domestic maritime industry's ability to serve LNG operators fails to acknowledge the abject failure by the industry to serve this sector despite over a decade of record production. This also falls into the purposeful obfuscation of bunker ships versus transportation ships. They are two different things. They're not the same, so we shouldn't conflate those two arguments. Unfortunately, this will prevail over my objections, so having had a moment and an opportunity to offer the amendment, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. What purpose does Mr. Scholten seek recognition? I mean, Scholten. I do that every time.
I know. It's all right, Mr. Chairman.
You need to go on one of our Codells so I can get to know you better.
Happy to join you anytime, sir. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I have an amendment that I want to bring to your attention today, although I will withdraw it with both Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Larson's commitment that you'll be willing to continue to work with me on this important issue. The context...
Let's get it designated.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you.
Please designate.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7659, offered by Ms. Scholten of Michigan, number 026.
Uh,
Without objection, the amendment would be considered as read. Ms. Scholten, 5 minutes.
Thank you. The context of this amendment is important. This month, we have faced not one but two potential government shutdowns. During the government shutdown in early 2019, the Coast Guard was the only branch of the U.S. Armed Forces not compensated while on duty. Because of their unique relationship in the funding cycle, it is more easy for our Coast Guard to be cut out of these fundings than other branches of our armed service. This shutdown in 2019, as you will recall, lasted for 35 days, over a month, without the Coast Guard and their families receiving a paycheck. And it marked the first time in history that members of any U.S. Armed Forces were not paid during a lapse in appropriations. For 35 days, 41,000 active duty Coast Guard members worked without pay, including 360 who were deployed to the Arabian Gulf, in addition to 6,200 reservists and 8,500 civilian personnel. There were heartbreaking stories of service members having to have garage sales to make ends meet. At my local station in Grand Haven, Coast Guardsmen and women were reliant on community generosity to get by. Many of station's 18, 19, and 20-year-old service members didn't have enough emergency savings to cover even 1 month of expenses. Their heightened anxiety and stress created by this disruption in pay increased risk for Coast Guard members during already dangerous missions. For 35 days, almost 1,000 families did not receive childcare subsidies necessary to allow them to care for their children while meeting mission demands. Death benefits were not paid to survivors of Coast Guard members who died while on active duty, and housing leases for personnel living in government-leased housing were not paid. Nor was this impact felt by the service members themselves, only service members themselves. Operational integrity suffered significantly in this period. Issuance of merchant mariner documents and licenses were ceased, vessel documentation and inspection of new commercial vessel construction was stopped, and recreational boating safety and bridge administration activities were halted. We must not let this happen again. Given, again, the current negotiations around the Homeland Security appropriations bills right now, I'm worried that this issue is as pressing as ever. Fortunately, we have a solution. Last year, with my co-lead, Rep. Gonzalez-Colon, I introduced the Pay Our Coast Guard Parity Act of 2023, and today I offer this bill as an amendment to the underlying bill. Previously introduced by Chair DeFazio during the 2019 shutdown, this language would ensure that the Coast Guard continues to be paid if the other branches of the military are paid, even in the shutdown. We can't leave them out on their own. Protecting our nation, both at home, on our coasts, overseas, away from their families, is essential. Coast Guard members need to know that they have financial security and that we have their backs. 2/3 of service members report that security and stability of a job had a great or very great influence on their decision to join the military. During a time when recruitment is near an all-time low for the Coast Guard, we need to ensure that we're doing all we can to ensure that they are placed on a level playing field. I do recognize the chairman's concerns about including this in the underlying legislation today, which is why I'm willing to withdraw the amendment from commitment, with a commitment from the chair to work together and address this issue. But I certainly welcome any remarks from my colleagues on this, and I yield back.
Thanks, Hillary. And I absolutely appreciate what you're trying to do and take care of those, the coasties. So I would be more than happy to work with you on this moving forward.
Thank you, and I withdraw the amendment.
Thanks. Mr. Perry,
Mr. Chairman, I've got an amendment to desk.
please designate.
435.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7659, offered by Mr. Perry of Pennsylvania, number 435.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. And with that, Mr. Perry, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's Energy Week this week, and yet, for the second year in a row, this committee on a bipartisan basis seeks to destroy the offshore oil industry with unnecessary manning and crewing requirements that will cripple the industry and make us far more dependent on foreign sources of energy. This amendment would remedy this misguided effort by simply striking Section 346 of the ANS. The underlying provision applies manning and crewing requirements to foreign vessels operating on the outer continental shelf. Now, proponents, my friends, of this provision cloak themselves in the veil of national security and creating American jobs. Unfortunately, this provision threatens both. In fact, under this provision, so long as the ship is owned, crewed, and flagged by the Chinese or Russians, they can operate on the outer continental shelf. That's right. As Mr. Garamendi already noted, our worst enemies can continue to operate under this provision as long as they own, crew, and flag the ship. This clearly does not improve our national security, and any argument to the effect is an obfuscation of the truth. While there is a hypothetical situation where this creates a few jobs in the long term, the immediate impact on jobs will be devastating, and the net result will be a loss of American jobs. The truth is that supporters of the underlying provision are creating yet another layer of protectionism in our maritime laws as a handout to special interests without regard to the consequences of such actions. Here are the consequences: a halt to offshore energy projects under construction and killing the potential for future projects, an estimated $27 billion in Gulf oil and gas development projects killed overnight. For every oil rig that is not created because of this misguided attempt to provide handouts to special interests, there are hundreds of downstream and direct maritime jobs actually lost. Through 2030, it is estimated that this provision will reduce annual investments by more than $15 billion, reduce supported employment by 137,000, reduce annual GDP by $12.6 billion, and reduce U.S. oil production by 600,000 barrels a day. That's staggering. All that's staggering to me. Killing jobs, reducing economic output, and increasing reliance on foreign oil producers. That's not good for American jobs, the maritime industry, or our national security. Yet that's what the impact of this provision will be. This attack on our domestic energy supply is expected from the other side of the aisle, but it's disappointing to me to see our folks fall into the same trap. Now, unfortunately, this will prevail over my objections, so I will ask unanimous consent to withdraw this amendment, but let's be honest with ourselves, this very provision threatens to derail the Coast Guard reauthorization process because of how destructive it will be to our offshore oil industry. As long as this provision is included in the bill, unfortunately, I'll be forced to oppose it. With that, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to withdraw.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. We are now considering the amendment in the nature of a substitute for the amendments. For what purpose does Mr. Garamendi seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Please designate.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7659, offered by Mr. Garamendi of California, number 178.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Garamendi, 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment was not included in the base text, so I intend to withdraw it. However, I would like consideration as the bill moves forward and the next iteration of the Coast Guard bill, that we take this issue up. Right now, the Coast Guard is empowered to use the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund to remove fuel from a grounded or sunk vessel. But it cannot use the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund to remove the vessel. It's kind of an interesting and crazy situation. So let's suppose one of those vessels that Mr. Perry was talking about transporting fuel to Puerto Rico is grounded. The Coast Guard can hire somebody to remove the fuel, but not the vessel, even though it could be a hazard, and certainly would be a hazard. And so this amendment simply would allow the Coast Guard to use the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund to not only remove the fuel from the vessel, but also to remove the vessel. Pretty simple. It's not in the base text. I understand that the chairman and ranking member might want to work on this in the future and maybe include it. If that's the case, I will withdraw the amendment, even though it is extraordinarily wise amendment.
So, and I very much appreciate what you're trying to do, and unfortunately with the scoring and trying to move it across the floor, that's what creates the problem.
Oh, a scoring problem. So we kind of
Trying to move it as suspension.
Yeah, I could argue for another 3 minutes about it, but I'll let it go, and let's see if we can be wise at some point, overcome the scoring issue. And, oh, by the way, there's, I think, $8 billion in the fund, unspent, and the amendment would limit to $1.5 billion the total amount of money that would be used annually to remove the vessel, as well as the oil or the fuel. Food for thought. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Withdraw the amendment.
Thanks, Mr. Garamendi. Any other amendments? Mr. Perry,
Mr. Chairman, I've got an amendment at the desk number 437.
please designate.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7659, offered by Mr. Perry of Pennsylvania, number 437, Revision 1.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. With that, Mr. Perry, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment prohibits the Commandant of the Coast Guard from taking any action pursuant to Executive Orders 13990, 14008, 14030, 14057, 14082, and 14096 relating to climate change. This amendment prevents the Biden administration from prioritizing ideological pursuits over maritime safety and security. Not here to argue about climate change or not climate change, just a matter of who should be dealing with it, and the Coast Guard has enough trouble dealing with the problems it actually has. There are other agencies better suited to deal with that. But through these executive orders, the administration has sought to address alleged global warming through a whole-of-government approach, ensuring that every agency, regardless of mission, bends at the knee to the climate altar and embraces the administration's radical climate agenda. Unfortunately, the misallocation of Coast Guard resources to fight climate change will lead to less safe seas and threaten to undermine the core missions of the Coast Guard relating to maritime safety and law enforcement. Last year, the Coast Guard put out its climate framework. Among other things, it claims the Coast Guard will continue to invest in renewable energy and energy storage systems at our facilities. We will also pursue vehicle fleet electrification and build out infrastructure for vehicle charging. The service's current goal is to achieve 50% electrification within 10 years. Now, let's be clear. When the Coast Guard is performing search and rescue and interdiction missions, relying on intermittent power sources and unreliable electric vehicles that are particularly prone to damage from salt water can mean the difference between life and death. These policies will make everyone, the service, the maritime industry, the public, less safe and will reduce the efficacy of the Coast Guard itself. Despite all the claims of climate catastrophe, the truth is the mortality rate from natural disasters has decreased by 98% over the past century. Misallocating resources at a whole-of-government level to address an issue that has become significantly less lethal over time is a profound waste of taxpayer dollars and should have no place in a sane society that is careening towards $35 trillion in debt by May. The Coast Guard should instead focus on its recruitment and retention crisis. It faces a nearly 10% shortage in the enlisted ranks, forcing the Coast Guard to take 10 cutters out of service, transfer 5 tugs to seasonal activation, and shutter 29 boat stations. Wouldn't it be great if they focused on that? Wouldn't that be awesome? But they're not going to. A service in such severe crisis must return to its core mission, the reason it's there in the first place, and resolve the issues threatening recruitment and retention so that it can conduct its core mission. There is no place for ideological pursuits while the House is on fire. And ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman, the House is on fire. I do urge support of this amendment, and I yield the balance.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chair, this amendment prohibits the Commandant of the Coast Guard from taking any action pursuant to 6 executive orders that address tackling the climate crisis, that addresses committing into environmental justice and addresses the promotion of the development of clean energy jobs in the U.S. This amendment is a sweeping attempt to brush away priorities that the proponent finds objectionable. It's not the first time we've seen this type of amendment, and we've defeated it before. Beyond the rhetoric, this amendment would have real impacts on the Coast Guard. Climate change is one of the biggest challenges of our generation, and the Coast Guard is experiencing its effects. For example, with increased storm activity and severity, search and rescue missions have become more frequent and difficult, and rising sea levels have made the Coast Guard stations and housing around the country more vulnerable. Ignoring the realities of the changing climate and extreme weather is short-sighted and irrational. And I would suggest for anyone who has concerns about recruitment at the Coast Guard and the challenges that it faces, I look forward to their positive vote on the appropriations bill later this week when we vote on the Coast Guard funding as part of the larger bill. With that, I yield back and ask folks to oppose this amendment.
Anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Mr. Auchincloss.
Thank you, Chairman. I disagree with this amendment for the reasons stated by the ranking member. I do want to use this opportunity to also register my concerns about underlying base text in the bill, which do not directly relate to the amendment, but do directly relate to the climate crisis. The Coast Guard is critical to our national security, and from search and rescue operations to drug interdiction to supporting our allies in the Indo-Pacific, the Coast Guard plays an important role in keeping Americans and all those at sea safe, particularly a salient mission now as Haiti remains in a state of emergency. And I strongly support the efforts to ensure the Coast Guard has the resources it needs to carry out its mission. However, the crewing and manning provision in the Coast Guard Reauthorization Act would decimate the offshore wind industry and prevent the United States from reaching President Biden's clean energy goals. If passed, all offshore wind installation vessels would be required to be U.S. flagged and crewed, but there are 0 existing vessels that meet these requirements. We must support our domestic shipbuilding and mariner capacity, but this provision would constrict offshore wind construction in the short term and would sacrifice union jobs and energy independence in the long term. We will not reach the President's goal of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 if this provision passes. And halting offshore wind production would jeopardize the creation of up to 83,000 domestic jobs by 2030. During last year's markup, I offered a solution that would ensure offshore wind can thrive in the short term and create a pathway to more American offshore wind jobs. A prevailing wage requirement ensures that American mariners are not being passed up for jobs that we have the ships and workforce to perform. I support the intent of the crewing amendment language, and I'm eager to support the development of our domestic shipbuilding and crewing capacity, but I cannot support the Coast Guard reauth with this language included. However, striking this section altogether, as my colleague from Pennsylvania previously proposed and then withdrew, is not the best path forward. We must find a solution to this problem that achieves our clean energy goals and supports American workers, and I believe my prevailing wage amendment is a good starting point for finding a solution that benefits everyone. I know that labor organizations have some potential changes to this text they would like to make. Of course, I'm happy to work with them and with all parties to come to a solution. I want to thank Ranking Member Larson for his commitment to working to resolve this issue, and I urge my colleagues to oppose the crewing and manning requirements currently in this bill, and I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to? Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I actually would like to go back and discuss the crewing and manning the amendment that Mr. Perry withdrew and Mr. Auchincloss just spoke on. This committee has debated this for the last two Coast Guard bills. We've debated this ad nauseum. We've had amendments voted on in this committee that have been like 62 to Auchincloss or something. I mean, just overwhelming margins. I think the second time it was like 60 to Perry Auchincloss and somebody else misguided. I don't remember who. I'm kidding. But I want to talk about what this actually does, because if what Mr. Auchincloss, my friend from Massachusetts, just said was correct, I would agree with him, but thankfully he's not correct. I want to be very clear on this, and I'm happy to go through the exact text of the language and point out where this is. This does not ban foreign vessels, period. It doesn't. It doesn't. It has an exception. But I got to tell you something. All we sit here and do in this Congress, we sit here and do these Buy America provisions. We've had a Jones Act that had been on the books for over 100 years that we've had presidents from President Reagan to President Obama have supported. We've had the chief naval officer, we had the commandant of the Coast Guard from every administration that has supported this, because we must have a defense industrial base, a robust one. Am I wrong? Well, let's take a look at what's happened when countries have had an opportunity to have leverage over us. Anybody remember COVID? Anybody remember PPE shortages? What happened? You had countries that were making PPE that intentionally bought it back on world markets, controlled the supply, jacked up prices. Are we going to subject ourselves to that on our defense industry? To our military men and women, to our warfighters? Who's going to stand up and say that you want China and whoever else to be responsible for building our military equipment in our ships? Look, the reality is, it is more expensive to do business in the United States. It is. Our tax laws, our labor laws, our environmental laws, and others. So what do? We had the previous administration put sanctions in place whenever they're strategic and made sense, because we all support free trade, but we support fair trade. You know what this administration did? They continued the same sanctions. They continue the same sanctions. Look, if somebody wants to stand up in this committee and say, I want Russian workers to displace American workers working in our waters, that's fine. And that's fine. You stand up and say it. I disagree with you. I want to give American workers a level playing field, because I support free trade, but I support fair trade. Giving American workers a level playing field. What the crewing and manning provision does, it doesn't stop offshore wind or any other type of energy projects. As I said earlier, the state that I represent, Louisiana, we have more offshore energy than every other state in this country combined. And you're telling me that I'm going to fight the industry? Come on, how much sense does that make? The reality is go back and look at offshore wind energy projects. They don't need my help or anyone else's help, and the projects being uneconomic. The largest ones have been withdrawn by the very folks that proposed to develop the projects, because the economics don't make sense in many cases, despite the incredibly generous subsidies that are out there. Mr. Chairman, let me say it again. Look, somebody wants to stand up and wants to fight for foreign countries, foreign workers over Americans and give them a competitive advantage. You stand up and say that, but then you're going to be held accountable for the 700,000 people that you're representing, that you're screwing. I support American workers. I support an American defense industrial base. And this bill, in fact, I'd love to tell you that it actually gives a level playing field. It doesn't. It doesn't. It still gives a competitive advantage to foreign vessels and foreign workers. I'd love to give a true level playing field, but I think this is the best we're going to get. I appreciate my friend from Pennsylvania and his concerns, and I appreciate his desire to fight for Louisiana's energy industry. The Louisiana delegation fully supports, Republican and Democrat, fully supports the provision that's in this bill, and that has been supported by overwhelming margins in the last two Congresses by this committee. So if we want to talk facts, I'll do it all day long. But if we're going to sit here and make up false narratives and then try and act on them, I've got major problems with that. Mr. Chairman, I support this underlying bill. As we noted earlier in the colloquy, I do have some concerns about some of the technical tweaks that have been made. Look forward to visiting that as we move forward. And I'll say it one more time. I am happy to sit down and negotiate with anyone who wants to talk facts and merit. But I'm going to put American workers over foreigners every day of the week. Yield back.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you for the indulgence. Just to be clear, I appreciate the gentleman from Louisiana and his passion, but early on in his talk, he seemed to imply something about the intelligence of the member of Massachusetts. And we can have this debate without that, and appreciate that. Also, ad nauseum, we have not debated this ad nauseum. We have debated waters of the U.S. ad nauseum since 2007. We've only been at this for 3 years, but if we could just kind of refrain from characterizing members' intelligence as we move through debate, I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Van Drew.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know, fortunately or unfortunately, you can't invoke the words wind turbines without me having something to say because I live and breathe this. So if you know the state of New Jersey a little bit, my district includes the New Jersey shore, a number of counties that rely on tourism and fishing and the beauty that they have there. And let me tell you how disappointed I am that there are those that keep pushing these wind turbines. And I want to make something very clear. I've spent a good part of my recent political life working on this and looking into it. They are very expensive. They are very inefficient. We have no proof that they can hold up under a hurricane. Yes, they have existed in Europe and other areas where they don't get hurricane-force winds like we do. We had major loss of whales because of the sonic testing that was done to locate where they would go. The moment that testing started, we lost and we had all these whale deaths that you read about and heard about. And then let's talk about the fishing industry a little bit. Fishing individuals, the people that make their living on this are good, hardworking people that deserve a fair shake, commercial fishermen and recreational fishermen for that matter, and they are universally opposed to this. They know what it's going to mean. There are those that have expressed concern as far as national security and how it's going to affect that as well, because these are structures that are 1,000 feet tall that are going to go, and I am not exaggerating, over millions of acres. Then you might want to talk about the utility bills. Utility bills are going to increase drastically because of the wind turbines, and even the companies that propose doing them that are mostly foreign controlled, which is another crazy thing. Why would we allow foreign countries to control our energy in the United States of America? But even those companies admit there's going to be very significant increases in your utility bills. What does that mean to middle-class working people, poorer people, those that can barely afford what the utility bills are right now? It means they're going to even have a harder time making it through day by day. And it's not only going to be at the Jersey Shore, it is going to be across the entire East Coast and wherever they go. There's so many answers to dealing with the carbon footprint. Clean nuclear, zero carbon footprint. There are other answers and technologies as well that I won't go into now. The point is these things don't work, and there are folks internationally that have invested in them, that have pushed them. It sounds like good politics. It's certainly good for those folks that are going to make money off of all this, and they are heavily subsidized. And the shame of it is, let me just talk about the state of New Jersey. There was at least in the past a fund that came from these energy companies, that came from the wind turbine companies, and the tax breaks they would get, that was going to go to those that are the ratepayer, the utility payer. They just had to take that away because they've even got to subsidize it billions of dollars more. I don't know when we're going to stop with this. You know, I'm willing to discuss the carbon footprint, man-made, naturally made, a combination of both when we see climate change. But let's do it in a way that works. Let's look at things like wave technology. Let's look at, clean energies like nuclear, which are advanced so much and have zero carbon footprint. And understand that these are going to require, these wind turbines only going to last 15 years if we're lucky. Some say 20, but most say really 15. And who's going to be responsible for taking them down? Their answer is they're just going to cut them down at the base and leave rest of the structure there in our beautiful ocean. I mean this. The ocean is a gift from God. To do what we're doing with these wind turbines it's a horrible shame. and it's a black mark on this Congress if we let that go through and continue. So I know I'm maybe a little bit off the reservation here because we're on something a little bit different, but we're discussing that. And again, if we talk about foreign interests controlling our energy and how dangerous it is, if we can talk about what's going on in our fishing industry, if we want to speak about how it's going to affect the ratepayer, it's one of the few things, and I've served in the state senate, the state assembly, I've served as a mayor, a county commissioner. Damn it, I've never seen anything like it that in my mind is all bad except for a select few people that are going to make a whole hell of a lot of money. Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Just to be clear, we are debating Perry number 3 or 437 revision 1. Does anybody else, well, it's not just you, does anybody else wish to be heard on the amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. May I yield my time to the member from Massachusetts?
Without objection.
I just need a minute. I'm not going to respond to the full diatribe from the gentleman from Louisiana. I'll just say, first of all, facts. Most of the man hours working offshore for offshore wind will be performed by American mariners, as operations and maintenance ships will be required to have all American crews. The ships of concern, the offshore wind turbine installation vessels, only operate for a couple of years during construction, and there are not enough of them, and again, 0 of them American-made, in the American fleet to build out the projects being prepared. So this is cutting off your nose to spite your face. There's going to be tens of thousands of American jobs that won't materialize with this misguided approach. And then I'll just speak more broadly to this jingoistic, borderline xenophobic attack on any kind of foreign inputs to American industry. This kind of mentality would have prevented American leadership in semiconductors. Goodness, we should ever have ASML as a key input from a Dutch company. It would have prevented telecommunications leadership. It would have prevented biopharmaceutical leadership. These are all industries where America has seized the lead because we have been the keystone of a globalized economy where we are adding the most valuable parts of the supply chain. And this type of approach ultimately is just going to cede clean energy leadership to other countries and ultimately cost American jobs and industry excellence. And I yield back to my friend from Alaska.
Someone else wish to be heard? Five minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, my friend from Texas. Look, I appreciate Mr. Perry offering the amendment, and then I'm going to move on. Number one, prevailing wage. My friend from Massachusetts. The IRA requires prevailing wage. It requires that vessels pay prevailing wage. What happened is those foreign entities went to the IRS and advocated that mariners be given an exception. All right, so IRA already required it. Number two, I'm sorry that some folks apparently don't understand this. There is not a requirement that they all be U.S. crude. I'd support that all day long. There is an exception process that allows for foreign crews. I'm happy to pull the exact section out of the bill and show it to you. Third, I'm glad my friend brought up semiconductors. That's a great example. That's a great example. Why did we do the CHIPS Act, which I want to be clear, I support the intent of the CHIPS Act. We did it because we were subject to China for semiconductors, for chips. So we invested in creating U.S. capacity. That's what the underlying intent here, or at least assist in, is ensuring that we actually have U.S. capacity for a defense industrial base. That's one of the intents of the Jones Act.
Would you be willing to engage
So
in politics?
I appreciate my friend's concerns, but I'll just say it again. In regard to the black letter of the bill, it doesn't have merit. It doesn't have merit. So I'm happy to sit here and have this discussion all day long. I think the chairman's about to electrocute me. And so I'm going to yield back to my friend from Texas.
Anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment?
Mr. Chair?
Chair Stauber.
I'd like to yield my time to the gentleman from New Jersey, Representative Andrew.
Thank you. I'm going to be brief. I just wanted to address Mr. Auchincloss. There's nothing jingoistic. There's nothing wrong with being American, support American workers, support American businesses. And for too long in this country, and if we're not careful, and again, I'm just going to digress for a second, and I beg the chairman's indulgence, but you know, when we look what's going on with Boeing, where, you know, they've globalized some of what they do, and we're concerned about the wrong issues. And we look at China now trying to get into the airline industry, and if they do it, believe me, they'll do it right, and they're going to be real competition. I hope someday we're not having to look to China to buy all of our airplanes. The bottom line here is that these wind turbines are going to benefit very few individuals, and you can't argue that they're going to cost more. You can't argue that the ratepayer is going to pay more. And I know this is about an amendment that's being withdrawn anyhow, but I just couldn't let those statements go. So I'm going to yield back to my friend, Mr. Stauber, and thank you. And I guess he's going to yield back to you.
Anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Mr. Perry? You've already had time. All right, going back to the amendment. Unfortunately, I do have to oppose it. I think what you're trying to do is much broader than what we're trying to do in this bill, but I would love to work with you more on holding the administration accountable. So with that, the question is on the amendment by Mr. Perry, 437, revision 1. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed signify by saying nay. It appears the nays have it.
Mr. Chairman, I have not a requested recorded vote.
Requested vote has been, recorded vote has been requested as previously announced pursuant to Committee Rule 6F. Further proceedings on the question will be postponed. You what? It is the last amendment? Okay. As noted, there were recorded votes on amendments requested. So again, pursuant to Committee 6F, further proceedings on the measure will be postponed, and we'll now move on to the next item for consideration. Next item up is H.R. 6140, the Fastpass Act. I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Committee on Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation from further consideration of H.R. 6140, and without objection, that is so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize Mr. Ezell to offer his amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk.
Please designate.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6140, offered by Mr. Ezell of Mississippi.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered as the base text for further amendments. I recognize Mr. Ezell for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud to offer and support the amendment in the nature of a substitute to the Fastpass Act. This legislation is a common-sense bipartisan solution to address delays at our nation's ports in the face of a disaster, a challenge that South Mississippi unfortunately knows very well. The language from the bill simply directs the Secretary of Transportation to study and report back to Congress the most efficient way to get critical supplies into ports in the event of a declared emergency. Thank you, Mr. Garamendi, for leading with me on this, and I appreciate your commitment, Mr. Chairman, as well as the efforts of the members of this committee in finding ways to strengthen our nation's ability to respond swiftly to disasters and bolster the resiliency of our infrastructure. I urge my colleagues to support this, and I yield back.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So to start, I support the concept behind H.R. 6140, the Fastpass Act. And if an amendment is adopted that addresses concerns that have been raised by the women and men who work at our nation's ports. I'll be happy to support it, and I understand there is one. As Americans, our purchasing habits have changed, supply chain disruptions associated with the pandemic affected importers, exporters, and consumers. While demand has returned to normal, we need to use the opportunity to prepare for the next supply chain disruption. This legislation looks specifically at how critical cargoes such as disaster aid can be more quickly moved through ports in times of national emergencies. So I just would note quickly here, I know Representative Hoyle from Oregon has an amendment. I'd like to see that adopted when we get there. If so, I'd certainly be happy to support this legislation and encourage my colleagues to do the same. And with that, I yield back.
Now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Our supply chain experienced some serious, severe disruptions due to COVID-19, the pandemic. And as folks on the committee know, we have been focused on legislative efforts to ensure that this does not occur in the future. This legislation requires a study by the Secretary of Transportation on efforts and potential methods for expediting the movement of critical cargo through ports and marine terminals. The study directed by the bill can help us better prepare and respond to future supply chain challenges and ensure that critical cargo is efficiently transported from our ports to its final destination. I want to thank Congressman Ezell for introducing this bill, and I'd urge my colleagues to support it. You want to speak?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman, yep.
I rise in support of the amendment. I want to thank Mr. Ezell for putting it forth. The purpose of it is very simple. That is that we expedite critical shipments through the port, and the amendment provides mechanisms to accomplish that. I look forward to the passage of the amendment, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Garamendi. Does anyone else wish to be heard on the bill itself? Seeing none, the amendment in the nature of a substitute is now open for amendment. For what purpose is Ms. Hoyle?
Thank you, Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Larson. I have an amendment at the desk.
Please designate.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6140, offered by Ms. Hoyle of Oregon, number 034.
Thank you. The amendment will be considered as read. Ms. Hoyle, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I strongly support this bill's efforts to bolster our supply chain in the event of an emergency and to try and prevent the types of medical shortages that we unfortunately saw during COVID. However, I have concerns that the bill's current language is too broad. The bill's language around emergencies could be interpreted as allowing the federal government to interfere with negotiated labor agreements, including by forcing port workers to return to work under the Railway Labor Act. Additionally, the bill's current pilot program language could be used to displace port workers. My amendment would clarify that this bill will not allow government overreach or interference into negotiated labor agreements and would help ensure that port workers' jobs are secure. I want to thank Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Larson for their support of this compromise amendment language, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none, I recognize myself for 5 minutes. The amendment does ensure that nothing in this legislation affects any pre-existing labor agreements. I think that's consistent with the intent of the bill, and with that, I urge support for the amendment. Are there any other speakers on the amendment? Are there any amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, the question is now on the amendment. Ms. Hoyle, all those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay.
No.
It appears that the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request recorded vote.
Gentleman requested a recorded vote. As previously announced, pursuant to Committee Rule 6F, further proceedings on the question are postponed. Are there any other further amendments? Seeing none, as noted, there was a recorded vote to one of the amendments requested. So again, pursuant to Committee 6F, further proceedings on the measure are postponed. We now move on to the next item for consideration. Our next and final items for consideration are two GSA capital investment and leasing program resolutions. I'd ask unanimous consent to call up the resolution in block and that the resolutions be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, that is so ordered. Recognize myself for 5 minutes on the GSA amendments in block. Today, we are considering two GSA resolutions, one for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, and the other is for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA. Approving the NOAA lease will improve the agency's space utilization by requiring them to achieve an actual space utilization of 60% or more. The resolution would also require GSA to sell the existing building, resulting in savings for the taxpayer. The DARPA resolution not only supports its national security mission, but it's more than 90% in-person actual utilization rate. I'd urge my colleagues to approve these resolutions in block. I now recognize Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support the two leasing resolutions before us today. One resolution permits GSA to continue housing the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, which is currently located in Arlington, Virginia. DARPA has occupied the space in the same building since 2011. Under a lease expires on December 22nd, 2026. The other resolution permits the GSA to lease new space for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, in Seattle, Washington. I support these resolutions and encourage my colleagues to do the same. That I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendments in block? Mr. Graves?
Mr. Chairman, at risk of you throwing something at me, I think Ms. Hoyle may have left. I don't think I see her over there, but I do have a question. I do a clarification on her amendment because we're having discussion. I want to make sure we understand how to vote here. So on this amendment that she did, I want to make sure I understand this. I'm absolutely not opposed to automation and new technology when it makes sense, but it seems like based on your comments and others that perhaps this amendment is designed to protect contract sanctity between ports and labor right now. That's my read of this. It's not designed to itself to prevent automation or new technology. I want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly, that y'all are just trying to protect contract sanctity and not disrupt existing agreements between ports and workers. Is that accurate?
Yes.
And so if I were to vote no on this, you potentially are voting to disrupt contract sanctity, contracts between ports and labor agreements. And if I vote yes on this, then I would be voting to protect those existing agreements.
The existing.
Okay, I just wanted clarification on the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendments in block? Well, we're bouncing around all over the place today. Hearing none. Yeah, are there any amendments to the GSA resolutions in block? Seeing none. The question is now on the adoption and approval of the GSA resolutions in block. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay.
Nay.
In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested on the GSA resolutions in block, as previously announced pursuant to Committee Rule 6F. Further proceedings on the question are postponed. So we are at that point now. We have what, three?
Probably going to be 4, but 3.
3 to 4 votes. We are going to briefly recess so we can get everybody in the room.
We'd like to vote no later than 11:30.
11:30. All right, we will start voting at 11:30. So the committee is in recess for a very short period of time so everybody can get here to vote.
Oh, we need Mr. Larson.
The committee will reconvene. So previously postponed proceedings on H.R. 7659. The question is now on the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7659 as previously postponed. First, Amendment number 437, Revision 1, offered by Mr. Perry, Pennsylvania, in which a recorded vote was ordered, which was not agreed to by voice vote. Is a recorded vote still requested?
Yes, sir.
Recorded vote is still requested. Members will record their votes by electronic voting system. This vote is going to be open for 5 minutes. The chairman intends to vote no.
Ranking intends to vote no as well.
Open the board. He also never did the yellow either when they were counting down for people speaking. There was never a 1 minute warning anytime during the day. So the timer's not working, but we have 3 minutes left in this vote.
You have a timer working, it's just not showing up correctly. Everyone was wondering, we do in fact have a real timer sometimes. The timer's working, the timer vacancy is working, the timer we can see is working.
What's wrong with the timer?
Larry's not sure because their timer is going correctly, just like our timer's going correctly. So he's not sure why it's not showing up right up there.
So the lighting system wasn't working when we were talking either.
Yeah, they never did the yellow 1 minute and during anybody's talk.
Does yellow not appear for members on the phone?
It should.
It always does.
It should. So maybe that. Well, I was noticing a delay between that timer and that timer while they were talking too, but it wasn't like. It was like 10 seconds. It wasn't anything that was going to mess something up.
2 minutes.
There it goes.
Because we do have the ANSs, we have to vote on the ANS, which should go voice, and then someone may call for a vote on the line. So if they do, we'll vote immediately. If they don't,
Boss end up winning his primary? Sam, did Boston end up winning his primary?
I don't know. Did he?
I thought his primary was
Boss win?
today. No, it was yesterday. He won.
Did he win?
He did.
It was a little closer, but the parties is the governor.
1 minute.
Mandate. One vote's a mandate.
That's right.
That's right.
Van Orden was running though here from VA. But hopefully.
Have all members been recorded who wish to be recorded? Do any members wish to change their vote? Last call. Hearing none, clerk, please close the vote and announce the vote total.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 22 yeas and 34 nays.
By a vote of 22 yeas, 34 nays, the amendment is not agreed to. The question is now on the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7659 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay.
Nay.
The ayes appear to have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
Recorded.
Wait, Mr. Perry?
On final, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
The question is now on the adoption of and favorably reporting of H.R. 7659 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay.
Nay.
The ayes appear to have it.
Recorded vote, Mr. Chairman.
Recorded vote has been requested. All right, we're going to, obviously, we're going to open the vote using the electronic voting system. This is going to be a 2-minute vote, so please open the board. And the chairman will be voting aye.
Ranking will vote aye. You sure, will that be reflected in both the absences?
It should, I mean, when we have the vote tally count, it'll show who just wasn't there to vote.
Right, okay. That's just,
Because it's in the bill report, so.
yeah, the report, yeah.
Have all members been recorded who wish to be recorded? Does anyone wish to change their vote? Now is the time. Hearing no one, the clerk, please close the vote and announce the vote total.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 53 yeas and 3 nays.
I voted 53 yeas, and 3 noes. The bill as amended is agreed to and ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The committee previously postponed proceedings on H.R. 6140. The question is now on the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6140 previously postponed. The First Amendment, 34, offered by Ms. Hoyle of Oregon, in which a recorded vote was ordered, which was agreed to by voice vote. Is a recorded vote still requested? A recorded vote is still requested. Members, please record their votes using the electronic voting system. The chairman will be voting aye.
Ranking will vote aye.
This is a 2-minute vote. Open the board.
John Russell, be a leader.
It's fine. We only got, what do we got? 1 left.
If someone asks for recorded vote on the underlying, you have 2 left, so we'll see. 1.
Have all members been recorded who wish to be recorded? Does any member wish to change their vote? Now is the time. Hearing no one, the clerk, please close the vote and announce the vote total.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 48 yeas and 8 nays.
A vote of 48 yeas, 8 noes. The amendment is agreed to. The question is now on the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6140 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended is agreed to. The question is now on the adoption of and favorably reporting of 6140 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill as amended is agreed to and ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The committee previously postponed proceedings on the GSA resolutions in block, the 2 GSA resolutions. The question is now on the GSA resolutions in block. As previously, which was previously postponed, is a recorded vote still requested? A recorded vote is still requested. Members, please record your vote by electronic device. The vote is going to be open for 2 minutes. The chairman intends to vote aye.
Ranking will vote aye.
Open the board. I don't have.
So when we're done, we just have to read that fun stuff. We good?
That easy.
Electronic voting is great.
No fuss, no muss. That's right. Try to.
So, this is not a bill, it's just a resolution.
Has everyone been recorded who wishes to be recorded? Does anyone wish to change their vote? Now's the time. Hearing no one, clerk, please close the vote and announce the total.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 53 yeas and 2 nays.
I voted 53 yeas and 2 noes. The GSA resolutions in block are agreed to and approved. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Thank you, everyone, for participating in today's markup. I'd ask unanimous consent that each of the measures reported today be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute, incorporating any amendments adopted without objection that is so ordered. I'd ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make all necessary technical, clarifying, and conforming changes to each of the measures ordered reported favorably today and reflect the actions of the committee. Without objection, that is so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 22, Clause 1, I'd ask unanimous consent the chairman or his designee be authorized to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to go to conference with the Senate on legislation adopted today or any similar measure. Without objection, that is so ordered. I'd ask unanimous consent the chairman, after consultation with the ranking member, have authority to strike or revise any provision of the measures ordered reported today that would cause a sequential referral to another committee or that would cause the bill to be subject to the budget rule or Rule 21, cut-go point of order, and without objection, that is so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I'd ask unanimous consent that all members of the committee have at least 2 calendar days in which to file any supplemental, minority, or additional or dissenting views on the legislation adopted today. Without objection, that is so ordered. Pursuant to Rule 6 of the Rules on the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, I note the presence of a quorum and for all actions on all committee business today. And with that, the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure has completed its business, and the committee is now adjourned.